Awesome. Thank you, Susan, for the introduction. I think, Deondre, you're going to begin, and then I'll follow you with our greetings to everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, Heather. Bonjour, Deondre Smiles and Disney. My name is Dr. Deondre Smiles. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Victoria on Lekwungen speaking in Wasanich lands in what is colonially known as Victoria, British Columbia. I'm a citizen of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, and I do work on human-environment interactions and the role of cultural resource management in Indigenous conceptions of political and environmental and cultural sovereignty. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Heather Castleden, who will introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Deondre, and thank you, Susan, for the invitation to speak at today's conference. It's our first time actually publicly speaking about our collective, about Archipelagos of Indigenous-Led Resurgence for Planetary Health. I'm a white researcher, health researcher, and a human geographer. It's a real honor to be able to work with this collective of Indigenous scholars, artists, academic, knowledge keepers and elders, youth, around developing this research program that we're going to be sharing a little bit about. My ancestry is Scottish and English, and I was born in the land of the Dene people in the Northwest Territories of Canada, but I also live in Lekwungen-speaking territories. And my work as an impact chair in Transformative Governance for Planetary Health at the University of Victoria tries to bring in the nexus of culture, place, and power. I work in solidarity with Indigenous peoples around embracing Indigenous rights, Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous resurgence, and resistance to colonial ways of doing things. So next slide, please, and I'll turn it back to Deondre.
If you've paid attention to the news lately, it's very, very clear that we are in the midst of a climate crisis. And I've taught quite often about this, and we'll elaborate a little bit more in the next slides about what this looks like. But one of the key things that kind of comes out is people often say, well, the world is ending. What can we do about this? We might as well either kind of resign ourselves to our fates or put our faith in tech bros like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos in order to help deliver humanity into this ecological salvation. And if you were to go in any Indigenous community, particularly in places like in Canada and the United States, or probably more notably to some of our international attendees, island nations like Kiribati, they might say, well, the world's already ended for us, right? And if the world has already ended for us and we're still here, we might have something yet to be able to teach humanity about how to contend with climate crisis and to be able to still ensure well-being in many different spheres. And so our research approaches this topic from that kind of viewpoint, that there isn't the end of the world doesn't have to be impending. And as a matter of fact, if we listen to the multitude of voices from Indigenous communities worldwide, we can learn a lot about how to contend with this. And so the goal of our research is to address climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and food, water, energy, and security through an Indigenous-led proof of concept project that is focused on research and practices for planetary health that will generate new health-related knowledge. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Deondre. So our evidence, as you know, and Deondre mentioned, it's unequivocal, right? That climate change is the greatest threat to our health as humans, other than human health and the health of the planet. And the 2022 IPCC report states that any further delay in action means that we're going to miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. But I think, as Deondre points out, there is hope, and that's where I think we need to turn to Indigenous peoples to look at how they're not ignoring this crisis. In fact, they're sustaining knowledge systems that embrace regenerative practices, which are in keeping with a healthy planet. They are leading efforts to reconcile global environmental change. They are stewarding over 80% of the planet's biodiversity, and they are engaging in activism that is stopping or delaying greenhouse gas pollution equivalent to at least 25% of annual US and Canadian emissions. So we need to sit up and take notice. Next slide, please.
Our research aims and our methodologies are multifaceted because indigeneity is not a monolith. It's very multifaceted and very situated in space and place. But there are kind of three main avenues through which our work proceeds, which is one of them is we want to disrupt the current practice of boxing up Indigenous knowledge into Western conceptions of health. So oftentimes Indigenous knowledge, when it comes into the academy and academic research and health research and environmental research, there is a move towards trying to make Indigenous knowledge legible to broader structures of power, to try to make it so it fits within these kind of narrowly defined boxes that we have come up for ourselves in academia. Our research team says that that's not the best way to engage Indigenous knowledge, and that we actually need to engage this knowledge where it is and take it as valid and engage with it on its own terms. The second research aim is to center Indigenous ontologies, epistemologies, axiologies, communities, and futurities in our Indigenous-led, community-based, and participatory health-related research, creative practice, land-based restoration initiatives, and policy analysis. And so this is a really unique project, right? We're not just going to sit here and churn out 20 peer-reviewed publications and call that good, right? We're also focused on, if we're focusing on situated knowledges, we're also going to focus on the ways that each knowledge can come through on its own terms. So we don't want to try to distill all this knowledge into things that, again, can be easily consumed by academia and policy analysts, but instead uplift these diverse voices that these Indigenous communities worldwide are presenting. And so we do a lot of we're planning on doing a lot of community-based work, participatory work, doing a lot of creative work. And we have we have some amazing visual artists and artists of other kinds on our team, focusing on land-based activities and research and work being done on the land with an eye towards restoration. And yeah, we'll do some policy analysis as well because it's important, but we want to try to be very multifaceted and diverse in what we're putting out there. And probably what I think is the coolest part of this project is we really want to explore the convergences and divergences, again, across study sites, or these so-called, quote, islands that we position our various study sites as through an archipelagic or linked islands approach. Next slide, please.
Yeah, exactly. And so while we're taking very careful approach to not pan-indigenize our findings once we get this research underway. We're not trying to broaden or distill or distort Indigenous worldviews, perspectives, protocols, or governance systems. And so when you look at this slide here, you can see, building on this notion of islands and archipelagos, when you look at islands, we see what's on the surface and they look disconnected. But in fact, when you look below the surface, and that's a lot of what we're trying to do is go deeper and look at how are these islands interconnected. And so when we think about Indigenous nationhood and how colonial mapping has really broken up ways to connect with each other across territories, across bodies of water, etc. This is what our archipelagic approach is attempting to do. So leads for each island, as you can see on the map on this slide, reflect the diversity of Indigenous nations that we are engaging with around the world. Each island, if you will delve deeply into understanding and linking the nuances and complexities of their communities, languages, ceremonial life, artistry, governance, and ecosystems within the territories. And so when we go to the next slide, we've got three overarching objectives. The first is to map and document where and how Indigenous-led resurgence is contributing to planetary health by working across scales. And so I'm going to give you a little example of a very small scale act of resurgence. But second, from there, we're going to create an Indigenous systems change model that assembles locally based Indigenous-led resurgence with activists, artists, and academics into this archipelago of planetary health. And then we're going to be engaging with Indigenous evaluators of our work rather than trying to fit evaluation into Western ways of looking at metrics of success. We're drawing on Indigenous metrics of success to show, does this approach of linking create change and contribute to the things that we talked about earlier about addressing climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, but also cultural ecological restoration. And so this is an example of Indigenous resurgence, one act at a time. And what happened here, this was one of our co-principal investigators, Jeff Corntassel, was doing a pit cook at the beginning of our school year on our university campus. And so what's happening here is in the first picture, you can see they're digging the pit, and then they're going to be cooking food in that pit. But what's interesting is juxtaposed in the second picture to the right of it, we can see Tuhai, so Cherokee term for living at the pace of nature. People are seated and being patient as the food cooks. And in the background, you can't quite make it out, but there's this frenzied counter-existence of what's called Thunderfest at the University of Victoria. It's the campus kickoff. They've got inflatables and free swag and those kinds of things. But what happens is you can see the food that's prepared in the picture below it. And then you see one of our other principal investigators, Dr. Hokulani Aikau, is returning the land to its original state. And so that's the kind of resurgent activities that we're going to be exploring, what's happening in multiple jurisdictions, particularly in Turtle Island and the Pacific Northwest. And I'll turn it over to Deondre for the last couple of slides.
So we have an extremely large team, and I think this is one of the real beauties of our project is that we've gotten a lot of buy-in from large segments of UVic as well as people from outside of UVic. And so our team is, and I use this word a lot, multifaceted, but very, very diverse and very wide-ranging. And so at the core, we have a team of 10 Indigenous principal investigators that are kind of the people that are heading up projects, applying for grants, and kind of helping to steer the overall direction of the Archipelagos project. We have an administrative lead, which is our very own Heather Castleden, who is, and I'll just throw this out here, has been doing an absolutely tremendous job at helping to push this project forward. We have a plurality of expertise across the humanities, the social and health sciences, ethics, and Indigenous, common and natural law, and even beyond that. We just have this really diverse team from a variety of different academic areas and areas from across academia and even outside of academia, which makes this project very adaptive and very responsive to kind of changes that we might need to put in or new directions that we need to go into. But we also have done a really good job at augmenting our team with expertise in engineering, natural science, and health science disciplines, professions, and sectors. And I think it's really important to note that even though it looks like this is a very hierarchical structure, we behave very much as a huge team of PIs, that there's not just, the core team of PIs running this project, but instead we kind of democratize and try to flatten out the power hierarchies wherever possible so that everybody who's on this team has an active stake in the work that's being done. And that's not just the 10 of us and Heather kind of steering the bus, but instead we're maybe the ones that are doing the work and kind of putting in the midnight oil so that we can be able to spread the benefits out to the entire team. But everybody in the team has an active input in decision making. So next slide, please. So as far as anticipated outcomes, these, again, there's a multifaceted word again, that it look like many, many different things, that things such as, yes, academic journal articles, because many of us, particularly on the Indigenous PI team, are early career scholars. Like myself, I'm only in my second year on the tenure track. And so we recognize that we do want to make sure that people that are early career are getting the things that they need in order to progress through the tenure process. But we're also thinking ahead about things such as documentaries and podcasts and a series of large gatherings and artistic productions. And so this is a really probably the most exciting thing out of just what is a really exciting project in general, is that we anticipate that these outcomes that we will be producing through this project will be extremely generative, but also will be very heavily locally contextualized. And so, for example, the archipelago that I'm on was with a number of other Anishinaabe scholars there in the Great Lakes. And so we focus on things such as water health and community health and food sovereignty, whereas folks in, archipelagos in the Pacific might be focusing on different things and look at different outputs. And so I think will really kind of drive home the fact that indigeneity at its core is really focused on situated knowledges, and our products that we will and outcomes that we'll talk about in our work will really reflect that. And so, yeah, that's a little snapshot of our work, but as we're still relatively new together, and so we are, but we've already done a lot of really, really cool stuff. And so, I'll thank you all for paying attention to us and engaging with us this morning. I'll also turn it over to Heather to thank you all and say her farewells as well.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Deondre, and thank you again for hearing what it is that we're planning to do. So we'll turn it back over to you, Susan. Thanks.